All right. Today, in our journey into Tall Tales, we are going to read The Tale of John Henry. I'm going to do a little bit of an adjustment. Wait, can I move my picture? Oh, I can. Okay. Get myself out of the way there. Whoa. Super zoom. Blink, blink. Okay. There's chapters in this bad boy, just so you know. Chapter 1 On Grandma Polly's Porch. Gather round, you two young'uns, gather round. After calling out this command, Grandma Polly settled back into her rocker on the porch. Grandma Polly was elderly, and she rested often. Sam was used to that, just as he was used to helping out around his grandmother's place. Sam lived just a few houses away, and he was at Grandma Polly's most afternoons and evenings. He liked helping her cook her dinner, and sometimes he even washed up. Sam's cousin Josiah had only visited a handful of times because he lived a few stations down the line. This weekend was one of those times. It had not been easy for Sam because Josiah questioned just about everything Grandma Polly and Sam said. "What's all that about?" Josiah asked Sam when he heard Grandma Polly's call. "Grandma's going to tell us a story," Sam explained. "She tells me a story every night before I go home." Who needs stories anyway?" scoffed Josiah. "What I'd like now more than anything is a cool drink." So before I turn the page, I like to kind of think about what we read so far in chapter 1. So we've got these two characters, Sam and Josiah, at Grandma Polly's house. They're cousins. Grandma Polly is their grandmother, obviously, and she tells them a story every night, or she tells Sam a story every night. Josiah, he's not there every night. He comes every so often. It says he lived a few stations down the line. Down the line would be like a train line. So he takes the train a few stations to get there. So he can't come every day. Unlike the story we read yesterday about Johnny Caw, this one is told in the third person. So the character is not telling the story. Like Johnny Caw's sister was telling the story in yesterday's, but this time we have an outside narrator. Something to think about. Sam did not say anything, but he knew Grandma Polly did not like to be kept waiting. Josiah knew that he had to do what his cousin did because that was one of the rules of visiting their grandmother. Josiah sighed and followed Sam. They both climbed the steps onto Grandma Polly's porch. Grandma Polly had brought out 3 tumblers of homemade lemonade. "Help yourself, boys," she said. Sam and Josiah each took a tumbler, and Josiah sighed again. It had been such a hot day that even the grass had withered in the summer heat. "This reminds me of the time your granddaddy drove the steel," said Grandma Polly, wiping away the beads of perspiration that had gathered on her forehead. Josiah looked sideways at Sam and whispered, "What does she mean?" Sam grinned because he knew this particular story extremely well. Grandma Polly had told it numerous times, but it was still his favorite tale. He could tell it almost as well as his grandma, and in fact, they often shared the telling. When Sam looked up at Grandma Polly, she gave him a nod. Sam began the story in the exact same way she always did. So they've settled into the porch at Grandma Polly's house, and they're about to share a story that Sam had heard before. So they're going to share the telling of it, which means Sam's going to tell a little bit of the story, and Grandma Polly will tell a little bit of the story. It's kind of a fun idea. And here they are on that porch. So you can kind of tell how old Sam and Josiah are. They're not like grown-ups, right? They're older children, but they're still children. Got their lemonade in their tumblers, which is a word for it, like a glass, right? And there's the train tracks right in front of her house. "It was in the days," Sam said, and then waited for Grandma Polly to carry on. "In what days?" Josiah asked, forgetting to whisper. Don't interrupt, young man, said Grandma Polly. It means in the long ago days, in the days of my beloved John Henry. Our granddaddy, said Sam, his voice full of pride. It was in the days when people were on the move, Grandma Polly said. The prospector, the railroad worker, the traveling salesman, husbands, wives, and children, they were all on the move. And my John Henry was on the move too. Grandma Polly continued. He had been enslaved, but now he was free, and he was looking for work. In those days, the travel was long and arduous, so that's why people began to build the railroads. Long lines of iron and steel joined up the territories of the whole of the United States, settlement by settlement. I came here by train, said Josiah, but it wasn't very far. Hush, said Sam. Listen to the story. Josiah glared at Sam for telling him to be quiet, but he did stop talking. So what I'm gathering from this is they're telling a story that happened long ago, but not super long ago. It sounds like, well, I know John Henry is the boy's grandfather, Grandma Polly's husband, who's not around right now, so I wonder if he's passed on. But she's saying that when he was born, he was enslaved, which means he was born into slavery. But he was free, so he was looking for work. Something that was going on in the United States at that time was the construction of the railroads to the west. So we know from social studies that people would have to take a ship to the west or go by covered wagon. And that was not a quick journey. So by building the railroads to the west, you could travel by train and get there much faster. So this is during the times where they were creating those train tracks, which was a lot of work and a lot of manpower to do that. So chapter 2 looks like we're going to get more into the story of John Henry, the steel driving man. So they talk about steel when they talk about train tracks because train tracks are made out of steel, obviously. Those are the tracks that the train runs on. So let's hear about him. Looks like he's going to become a railroad worker himself. John Henry was the biggest railroad man who ever lived, said Sam, continuing the story. The biggest and the best. Grandma Polly added, he was tall like an oak tree and broad like a barn, stronger than a dozen men and handsomer than any man. He was a steel driver, said Sam. That means, he said quickly before Josiah had a chance to ask, someone who hammered steel rods into the mountainside so the workers could blast away the stone and lay the railroad tracks. So steel rods into the mountainside. So they would put the rods in the mountainside. He would pound it into the side of some rock. When you took it away, there would be like a hole, and they would put some dynamite in that hole and blast away the side of the rock so that they could continue their tracks through the mountains, right? Did they blast away the mountain with dynamite? Asked Josiah, his eyes lighting up at the thought. Yes, answered Grandma Polly. They put the dynamite in the holes my John Henry made. And then, boom, said Sam. Our granddaddy was the most powerful steel driver they had. It was dangerous work, and it was hard work. But granddaddy was generous, too. If the other men got tired, he'd step in and finish what they'd started. He hammered long steel rods into solid rock. Can you imagine that? Asked Grandma Polly. My John Henry could move mountains, and that's the truth. So obviously, if you want to blast out rock, you have to, like these holes that you're putting into the side of a mountain, they have to be pretty deep so that you really can get the dynamite shoved in there. I don't believe, began Josiah, unable to help himself. Sam tried to quiet him, but Grandma Polly had heard him. She looked at Josiah with a twinkle in her eye. If you don't believe me, young man, she said, then I will prove it to you. When Josiah asked her how she could prove that John Henry could move mountains, Grandma Polly said, Sam, why don't you show your cousin? Sam stood up and went inside. Wonder what he's getting. Josiah watched Sam disappear indoors and then asked where his cousin had gone. Grandma Polly replied with a look that said, "Wait and see, young man, wait and see." Soon enough, Sam returned, carrying a heavy rod of steel that was taller than Sam. "Wow," said Josiah, clearly impressed. "Can I have a turn at lifting that?" Sam passed Josiah the rod and said, "That's what Granddaddy hammered into the mountainside." "It's a mighty thing," Josiah replied, feeling the rod. Sam looked at Grandma Polly, and she returned his gaze with a nod. Sam went back inside, and when he returned, he was dragging something very heavy. There's a picture of what he's dragging. "What's that?" asked Josiah. "That's the hammer John Henry used for hammering in the rods," said Grandma Polly. Kind of reminds me of Thor a little bit, right? "Can I have a turn at lifting that?" asked Josiah, jumping up. "You can try," said Sam, "but I can't lift it, so I bet you won't be able to either." Josiah heaved with all his might, but he couldn't raise the enormous hammer a single inch. "Now, did you want to hear what happened next?" asked Sam. Josiah no longer scoffed, but instead nodded and said, "I guess." "No need to guess, young man. I'll tell you," said Grandma Polly. "It happened after John Henry and I met and got married. Not long after that, it all went wrong." Grandma Polly paused and then became silent. Josiah noticed a tear run from the corner of her eye. "So what happened next?" Josiah mouthed, turning to Sam. Some suspense there. So we've learned about John Henry. He's a steel driver. He uses this great big heavy hammer to drive these extremely long steel rods into the side of mountains, into rock, solid rock, so that people can shove dynamite down into holes that he creates and blast away mountains. And all of that is in order to create a railroad track running through those mountains to get people out west. Grandma Polly is talking about how, he was well respected, and he would help others. And now she's saying something bad's going to happen. So let's get into chapter 3. Chapter 3 is the traveling salesman. Sam realized that his grandma was upset, so he was the first to speak. What happened next was something terrible. "I can't imagine," Josiah said. "Wait and listen," Grandma Polly suggested, her voice quiet and her eyes full of tears. Grandma Polly looked down at Sam and signaled for him to continue telling the tale. "Well, what happened next was that one day a traveling salesman turned up at the mountainside," said Sam. "The mountainside where Granddaddy worked?" "The very same," said Sam. "They were building a tunnel through the mountain, and hundreds of men were driving the steel and moving the stone. When the wind was blowing in my direction, I could hear the noise they made from the porch," said Grandma Polly. Hold on, my phone's making noise. Sam continued. "All this salesman was interested in was selling stuff and making money, and making a point of winning." "My daddy's a salesman," said Josiah, a note of hurt in his voice. So what's happening is they're driving steel into the mountains. They're going to create a tunnel through this rock. And so all these men are working on it. They're driving steel. They're hauling out the rocks that get blasted away. And the salesman shows up. Josiah's a little bit hurt because his dad's a salesman. "Your daddy is nothing like this man was," said Grandma Polly. "They're as different as fire and ice, I'm telling you." "This salesman was a miserable fellow," said Sam. "Maybe the heat and dust made him that way." "So what was this miserable sales fellow selling?" asked Josiah. "He wanted to sell the railroad company something called a steam drill." Josiah looked puzzled. "A what?" "A steam drill did the same work as a man with a hammer and rod," Sam explained. "Only the salesman said his machine could hammer the rod faster than a man could, and it could do the work of many men. He said, 'Who needs men to do work when a machine can do it better, faster, and cheaper?'" "Some machines can," began Josiah. Sam didn't give his cousin time to finish that sentence. It was as if the story of John Henry had taken him over. So you could imagine what a machine like this would, how that could cause problems for um, someone like John Henry. His job is to do this work, but what if a machine did do it faster? Then he would no longer have a job, right? And that would be trouble because people need to work to make money and support their families, right? And Granddaddy, said Sam, when he heard the salesman talk, he said that no machine was better or faster or cheaper than him. They didn't pay enough money as it was. The other men laughed at this. The salesman just laughed too. And then he challenged Granddaddy to a contest. Grandma Polly began to move back and forth on the rocking chair, and as she did, the floorboards squeaked, sounding high and ghostly, like thin whistles coming from far away. The wind rose and blew softly into their faces. I can still hear his hammer pounding and the steam drill hissing, said Grandma Polly. Josiah looked up at her, his mouth wide open. The salesman said that if Granddaddy could beat the steam drill, then the railroad company could have the drill for free, said Sam. I told him not to do it, whispered Grandma Polly from her rocking chair. Sam stood up and put his arm around his grandma. But he had to, she said to the boys, because he didn't want those men to lose their jobs, so he took up his hammer and set to work. So there is a challenge going on between John Henry and a machine about who could drive more steel rods more quickly and efficiently into the mountainside. And if the machine were to beat him, then the railroad company would probably purchase the machine and the men would lose their jobs, right? Because you don't have to pay a machine. And if John Henry wins, then the machine is given to the railroad company for free. I don't know. It seems like win, lose, this machine's still going to become a part of their lives. It doesn't sound like there's really a good outcome. But I do want John Henry to win because he sounds like a good guy. Because the reason why he's doing this is because if you look here, he didn't want those men to lose their jobs. So he's doing it not just for him, but his buddies that he works with too. Chapter 4, the contest. The day of the contest was fiery hot like today, as if there were a fever in the air, continued Sam. Did the grass shrivel up? Asked Josiah. It sure did, Sam replied, and the mountain was colored tawny, like a dusty mountain lion. When the contest started, continued Sam, John Henry and the steam drill set to work. Granddaddy was hammering so fast, plunging the rods into that solid rock. Dust and dirt rose up into the air, and people were sweating and choking. Stop, John Henry, stop, they shouted, because they could see Granddaddy swaying on his feet. So he's pounding and pounding and pounding, and it's super, super hot. He's getting hot. He's not quitting, though. Everyone's getting worried about him, like, oh my gosh, he's going to pass out. Why didn't he stop? Asked Josiah. Because he was our granddaddy, the biggest, strongest, and most determined man alive. He hammered in the rods faster and faster. Then he grabbed up another hammer. Now he was wielding a hammer in each hand. Oh my gosh, so he's not just like one hammer. He's got a hammer in each hand, so he's drilling into these rods 2 at a time now. Did the steam drill beat him? Josiah asked. The steam drill sputtered and steamed and drilled deep down, but it never drilled as fast or as far as John Henry did, said Grandma Polly, taking up the tale again. My John Henry won that battle. I just knew he would win, said Josiah. He won the battle, but he lost the war, Grandma Polly said. Huh, I think I've heard that phrase before. It's kind of an interesting one. What does that mean? Josiah asked. It means, said Sam, that the contest killed Granddaddy. His brave heart burst, he toppled over, and then he died. They were all quiet then. He won the contest, but the amount of energy and exertion exhausted his body so much that his heart burst. He toppled over and died. Have you guys ever read the book Stone Fox? Totally. I have a connection to that book with that part right there. I guess I understand why Grandma Polly gets so teary-eyed telling this story. Eventually, Josiah broke the silence. That story is so sad, but it makes me wish I'd met Granddaddy. A cricket chirped, a frog croaked, and a train whistled. Soon the train went by with a rush and a roar. It's heading for the tunnel Granddaddy helped to build, said Sam. I'd love to see it, said Josiah. Let's go along and look tomorrow. It's not far from here, said Sam. I might even come with you, said Grandma Polly. It's sad to remember, but it's best not to forget. There's plenty of stories about John Henry, said Sam. Once you hear a story, it belongs to you forever, said Grandma Polly, and stories never die. So even though John Henry died, his story lives on forever by people retelling it and retelling it. This is kind of an interesting tall tale. It's like not the funny kind of tall tale. Like usually tall tales are like silly and funny, like Johnny Caw, Paul Bunyan, things like that, if you've ever read those before. But this one's very, very sad, and it makes you think, right? So it is still a tall tale, in the way where we've got this larger than life hero, John Henry, who's able to do these amazing things that a normal man would not be able to do, like wield two extremely large hammers and pound in these metal rods faster than a machine could, and fight so hard that he topples over and dies at the end through this heat. So there are some elements there. There is some hyperbole, but it's a little bit different. So I wanted to read this one together. What you're going to do today, now that we've finished reading, is you're going to go into your Tall Tales questions document, and you're going to answer the questions for Tuesday. So I'm going to pause a minute, and I'm going to pull those up, if that is okay.